Mcgiiver here with my latest project. I picked up this stock at a yard sale. The guy asked me, he asked me if I wanted it. I said I really have no use for it. So he says he's going to throw it into his fireplace for firewood. At that point I said, whoa, it's time out. You know, for 10 bucks I'll take the thing. So I got the stock, and I had a lot of trouble figuring out what it fits. Turns out it fits a BSA Monarch rifle, or also a BSA Royal or Majestic rifle, which is a 30-06 rifle made in England. So I set about looking to see if I could find a barreled action for the stock. That was next to impossible. In fact, you can barely find the entire rifle for sale, let alone the barreled action. So the stock sat around for a few months. Then I got the idea that maybe I wanted to put a single shot barreled action into this stock, just for something to do. So I began my search looking for a 22 single shot barrel action for this, and the problem was that many of the single shot barrel actions, the bolt is way up here in relation to the trigger. So I had to find an action where the bolt was basically a 1/4 inch in front of the trigger. And it turns out that some of the Remington 500 series 22 rifles are like that. There are others, but the Remington 510, 513, like that. I could not find any of them at a good price. I was looking for a beat up barreled action, something that maybe I could re-blue and maybe needed some work. The idea was I wanted to get it cheaply. This is the barrel action that I'm going to put into the BSA stock. It's a single shot action. I wanted to stick with a single shot action so I didn't have to deal with the putting a magazine into the stock. That just complicates matters. So it's a single shot action, and as you can see that the bolt is lined up a little bit ahead of the trigger, which is what I wanted. It's a cocking lever there, and it should work out. It's actually in pretty good shape. This is a JC Higgins Model 103.181, which I believe is a JC Higgins Model 41, which is the same as a Marlin Model 101, if my research is correct. So we're going to fit this into the BSA stock, and hopefully we'll come out with something that looks decent. The plan of action is to take this barrel action and put it into this BSA stock. So it should turn out to be a nice, beautiful stock. The action is held in with one screw, so what I'll have to do is fabricate a floor plate for the stock, drill a hole in the floor plate for the action screw to hold it in, and that will clamp the barrel into the stock. I'll have the screw extending through the floor plate. That'll pull the barrel action into the stock. The idea is to fill in the gap between the barrel action and the stock with epoxy, which I've done partially already. It doesn't have to be pretty. Only the part that is exposed should be nice and neat there. And I'm going to show you some pictures moving forward as to the steps to take you through that process of putting this action into this stock. This is the view of the stock before any bedding material is put in to set the action into the stock. Here you can see that the action is well suited for this stock. The trigger lines up with the slot in the stock, and the action screw will go right in the magazine well. I'm going to fabricate the floor plate from 3/16 steel flat stock to clamp the action into the inletted groove on the stock. At this point, I have the floor plate just about done. I have to work something out for the trigger guard here. Not quite sure what I'm going to do there, but I have two countersunk socket head screws here. This one is 1/4 very hard to find, but I found it. And the floor plate, basically I made it by hand because I didn't have access to a milling machine. At this point, the action seems to rock a little bit in the bedding. I think somewheres in here there's a high point in the bedding which is causing the action to rock. That's what I'm going to have to try to find out and correct that. As far as a butt plate, I'm not sure what I'm going to do here. I think what I'm going to do is use this slip-on recoil pad that I've cut in half to fashion a butt plate for this. I'll try it and see how it looks. If I don't like the looks, I'll change to something else. I'm thinking putting 3 brass screws to hold it on here. That might look nice. If it doesn't, I'll see if I can find a commercial butt plate to put on there, which is not so easy because this is pretty wide here and this is fairly high. So finding a commercial butt plate is not all that easy. What I have done with the floor plate, I needed to secure the front end of the floor plate somehow. So what I did is I put a brass insert into the stock for a 1032 screw, which will hold the front end of the floor plate there. At the back end of the floor plate, since it's basically unsupported, it's only held in place by the main action screw and the 1032 screw at the front. What I did is I put in what I call a jack screw, which is just a bolt, a hex bolt, ground flat, screwed into the original action hole in the stock. And the idea is that I can raise this up or down to get the proper support for the back end of the floor plate. The action is held into the stock by this 1/4 socket head screw there. And don't know if I can get you the light in there. In there is the 1/4 screw. What I did not want to happen is to have that screw tightened down so tightly that it crushes the bedding or crushes the wood. So I've made a little pillar that will go over the action screw, and what that will do, that will limit the amount of tension I can put, clamping force that I can put between the floor plate and the barrel action, such that I don't crush the wood either on the top or where the floor plate meets the wood. It makes a positive stop for the bolt as you're tightening it. As I mentioned before, I think the barrel is rocking at a high spot in the barrel channel here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take and put Prussian blue on the barrel, set it into the action, and see where it'll leave a mark on the stock where the high point is, and then I can relieve the high point to stop the barrel action from rocking in the stock. That's a kind of a messy operation with Prussian blue. Alternatively, I could take a candle and smoke the action here, put it in, wiggle it and see where the soot marks are left on the stock, and that'll tell me where the high point is that I have to relieve. I think what I'm going to try first is to smoke the action with a candle, because that's a lot less messy than using Prussian blue. So what you do is hold the flame of the candle very close. If you hold it down here, you don't get the soot. But the idea is to get the soot onto the action. You do that by putting the middle of the flame on the metal. And this should leave a decent coating of soot that will be transferred to the stock and hopefully show me where the high point is. If this method doesn't work, then I will go to the Prussian blue method. Let's see what we have. The idea is to put it into the stock as carefully as you can. And then we tighten the action screw. And hopefully we will transfer the high point to the stock. And we'll just bong it a little bit. Remove the action from the stock. And look for any points of contact. At this point, I have the floor plate worked out. Floor plate has been blued and works fairly well. I was going to make a homemade butt plate, but I started working on it and it looked too cheap, so I decided to just buy a commercially made butt plate. And I'm waiting for that to come in so I can fit it. That will allow me to sand the rest of the stock. The stock, I've been sanding it, and it's really a tough job. When they made the stock, there's milling marks in the stock that have to be taken out. I don't know if you can see them. Basically, the cutter left the surface of the stock in a very rough condition, and I have to sand that down. I'm trying to do that with as fine a sandpaper as I can, so I don't leave sanding marks in it. When you get to areas like the wrist here and the pistol grip, it's very difficult sanding in there. I use a sanding block to do it, but you can't get into the curves, and there's a lot of handwork needs to be done. Overall, the sanding is a very, very tough job. One of the issues I had with this JC Higgins action was that the trigger pull was very heavy. It was about 10 pounds. That was due to this little spring right there. I looked for a commercially made spring that was lighter, but I couldn't find one. So I wound a spring on the lathe, and now I've got the trigger pulled down to about 4 pounds, and it seems nice. I made another YouTube video of how to wind a spring on the lathe. You can look at that. It's called Spring Making on a Lathe. That's on my channel also. At this point, most of the work involves sanding the stock. When these semi-inletted stocks come, there's a lot of wavy marks from the tool marks where they mill the stock from a blank. A lot of areas are very difficult to sand, like in here. The pistol grip is very difficult to sand because you have to go with the grain and get the sanding marks out, but when you're going with the grain, you're not taking off very much material quickly, and it just seems like it takes forever. The buttstock, where it meets the butt plate here, I hit it with a straight line machine sander, which shapes the butt plate at the same time. That would have been very difficult to do on a grinder, but the straight line sander seemed to work fairly well. It leaves a little hairy edge on the butt plate, which I can take off very easily. So I'm getting to the point where I'm almost done with the sanding and getting ready to start putting the Birchwood Casey Tru-Oil finish on the stock. The sanding process leaves a lot of dust on the stock, and that dust gets into the grain. So we want to remove the dust before we put any wood filler on, so that we get good adhesion of the wood filler. So I'm going to wipe the stock down with lacquer thinner. So I'm going to just wipe it down with the lacquer thinner. Oh, this stock will look beautiful. As you can see, that's what it'll look like after it's finished. As you can see, the front of the gun stock is already back to its dry condition. Excuse me, the lacquer thinner evaporates very quickly. So now I've taken my Valspar paste wood filler, took a little bit of it, put it on here, mixed it with a little bit of mineral spirits just to thin it out a little bit, and now I'm going to apply it to the gun stock to fill the grain. The idea is that you apply it and you put it across the grain. I just use my finger to do it. And the idea is you put it on across the grain so that it fills the grain. Let's see what I'm doing here. stuff starts to dry basically as soon as you put it on. It dries fairly quickly. And then you take a, it's better with burlap, but that's the only rag I have. After it sets for a little bit, you rub it off across the grain, the excess. And it's better to get as much as the excess off as you can, because if you leave lumps like this, they become very hard to get off. Once it's completely dry, they're tough to get off. So we continue doing this over the entire stock, and then let it dry for a day or two until it's completely dry, and then you sand it with very fine sandpaper, and then start applying the Tru-Oil finish after that. Okay, this is what we got after we put the wood filler on and wiped it off across the grain. Now I'll let this dry for a day or two. You can tell when it's dry. And then I'll resand it and then start applying the Tru-Oil finish. You have to wipe across the grain so you don't pull the filler out of the grain. There's a temptation to wipe with the grain, but that's the wrong way to do it. This is the stock after the paste wood filler has been put on it, and I've let it dry for about 3 days. Now I'm going to try wet sanding it just to get the little surface imperfections off of it. As you can see, it's a much darker color now because the linseed oil wood filler has soaked into the wood. This is closer to what it will look like when it's finished with the Tru-Oil. So now I'm going to do the wet sanding. I'm using some partially used 320 paper and 600 paper. I generally like to go with fine wet and dry papers, and I'm using water to wet the paper. The idea is when you wet the paper, it prevents the sanding dust from embedding itself in the paper, and the sanding paper lasts a lot longer. Okay, so this has been wet sanded now, and as you can see, it looks a little foggy or cloudy because we took the surface shine off from the linseed oil wood filler. Now you sort of just check it with your hand, and you can find some where the water raised some of the grain. You have to do a little extra sanding. I can feel it right here. Yeah. So now we let this dry because there's some water embedded in here, and then we'll start with the first coat of Tru-Oil. Okay, now the stock has dried after I wet sanded it from the wood stock filler, and I'm about to put the first coat of Tru-Oil onto the stock. I take the Tru-Oil and pour it from the original bottle into a small bottle so I don't waste it because it tends to dry up in the big bottle. This is the stock after it's had one coat of Tru-Oil on it and it's been dried. This has been drying for about 2 days now. I like to put it in front of a heat vent, let the hot air flow over it so it gets nice and dry, and the Tru-Oil takes on a hard finish to make it nicer to sand. So now I'm going to wet sand this with wet or dry paper. I'm using 500 grit, and the difference between wet and dry sandpaper and normal sandpaper is the wet or dry has a paper that withstands water or liquids, whereas normal sandpaper, the paper would disintegrate if you got it wet. So I'm going to use the 500 grit. I would rather use 400 grit, but I don't have any, so 500 is going to do. And the idea is that I'm going to take most of this finish off. I want to get it down so that the surface of the wood becomes flush. And that's going to involve taking most of this off. But there still will be Tru-Oil in the wood and in all the pores. Here you can see that the wet sanding is complete, pretty much complete. It left the very cloudy finish because we scraped up all the Tru-Oil that we put on. Here's an example, I don't know if you can see it, where I did one side and the Tru-Oil was running. You want to try to avoid that by rubbing the Tru-Oil in very well with your fingers until it becomes tacky. So now we will let this stock dry. You can see the water soaked into the stock a little bit here. This has to dry thoroughly, and then we'll put another coat of Tru-Oil on it. We'll let that coat dry for about a day or two until it's nice and hard, and we'll just keep repeating that process until we get a finish that is really smooth and glossy, and all the grain will be filled at that point. Here we have the stock after it's been sanded and wet sanded a couple times and a coat of Tru-Oil put on it. Okay, here we've drilled and tapped the floor plate to put the trigger guard on. We're using these little Allen head cap screws. Problem is that I couldn't get the cap screws in black oxide finish like that, so I just have to use a magic marker to blacken the screw so that it matches the trigger guard. It doesn't matter because the screws are recessed anyhow. There won't be any wear on the finish. But that is the trigger guard attached. So a couple more coats of Tru-Oil and this project may be complete. At this point, the Tru-Oil finish is pretty close to being final. I take this video because I want to show you what the stock looks like after it's wet sanded between Tru-Oil coats. On the right here you can see obviously this is coated with Tru-Oil, and here is what the stock looks like after it's been wet sanded since the last coat. You can see almost all of the Tru-Oil is removed during the wet sanding. The idea is to take the high spots off so you fill the grain. This is what I call the JC Monarch project rifle. Substantially complete at this point. I think it came out fairly decent. It was just a project to keep me busy. I think it's a more attractive rifle now than what it was before with the plain Jane JC Higgins stock on it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and leave your comments in the area below on YouTube, and thanks for watching.